Bardstown, Kentucky has a deep history, dating back to the year 1780. European Americans settled this area during their westward expansion, and Bardstown became the second oldest town in Kentucky state history. A quick internet search will enlighten you to the town's many claims to fame, including storied visits from US President Abraham Lincoln, the outlaw Jesse James, and the legendary frontiersman Daniel Boone. Much more recently, Bardstown has won a handful of awards complimenting the beauty and grandeur of the small town. Rand McNally and other destination contemporaries have voted Bardstown as the most beautiful small town in America on more than one occasion. The town has been made famous for one reason or another since its inception, but in the past few years, a more grimy, unsettling story has begun to write itself in the history book of Bardstown. Unfortunately, the story doesn't have a clear-cut ending, and there really isn't anything resembling a conclusion to this story. But there's no better or worse place to start this story than on the fateful day of May 24th, 2013.
Hello? Officer down, Bluefield Road.
Welcome to Unresolved. I am your host, Michael Whelan. If you have followed along with the podcast for a while now, you'll recognize this story as being one I've already covered, all the way back in February of 2016. The entire Bardstown saga was one that I covered in the early days of this podcast, but for a while now, I've really wanted to go back and add in some new information, in addition to fixing some things and re-recording everything. So, over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be re-exploring the story of Bardstown, making sure to include all of the information we have since learned. And honestly, it's a lot. My original 2 episodes is quickly becoming a 6 or 7 episode series, so you're going to be hearing a lot about this town and its stories over the next month or so. However, before we get into that, I'd like to briefly tell you how you can help support this podcast, Unresolved. If you would like to support the show, please consider heading to patreon.com/unresolvedpod to get access to commercial-free episodes, bonus episodes, and much more. Once again, that's patreon.com/unresolvedpod. You can also support the show by buying some podcast merch. Just head to our website, unresolved.me, and click on the store icon at the top of the page. To learn more about the show, just listen through to the close of this episode, or visit the aforementioned website, unresolved.me. Now, let's turn back the dial and learn a bit more about the subject of today's story, Bardstown police officer Jason Ellis. Born on September 22nd, 1979, Jason Scott Ellis was the one and only son of Pam and Charles Denny Ellis. Growing up in Batavia, Ohio, he had 2 sisters, Lacey and Kelly, and Jason loved his family so much that he could not wait to add numbers to their ranks. Jason was a star baseball player growing up. He played catcher for his Cincinnati-based high school team, Glenesta High, where he went first team All-City in 1998. That year, he also won Player of the Year for the Queen City Conference. Eventually, he went on to play baseball at the University of the Cumberlands, which moved him south to Williamsburg, Kentucky. During his athletic career for this liberal arts school, known as the Patriots, Jason played in 186 games and put up record numbers for hits, doubles, home runs, and RBIs, records which stand to this day. It was while Jason attended University of the Cumberlands that he met a young woman named Amy Phillips. The two were both college students there, and on Valentine's Day in 2001, they met at a party being thrown by a mutual friend. They immediately hit it off, with Amy recounting later on how she knew Jason was the one for her on their very first date. According to her, on that date, they were accompanied by Amy's mother, acting as an accidental chaperone and third wheel when Amy double-booked her evening. But the true spirit of Jason shined through when he picked up both mother and daughter for the date, bringing a bouquet of roses for both. That was just the type of person Jason was. Jason and Amy would get engaged that next Christmas in the latter days of 2002 and would marry in October of 2004. Meanwhile, Jason would eventually be signed by the Cincinnati Reds organization, his hometown baseball team, and he played for their minor league system for a period of time between 2002 and 2004. It was his love of Amy and his desire to start a family that led him away from baseball. In 2004, Jason played his last game of professional baseball for the Billings Mustangs, the Pioneer League affiliate for the Cincinnati Reds. Amy was pregnant with their first child, Hunter, who would be born just 2 weeks after Jason left baseball behind forever. Hunter was born with Down syndrome, but that did not stop Jason and Amy from loving him with all of their hearts. From that day forward, Jason put his heart and soul into fulfilling another dream he had since childhood, becoming a police officer. The young lovebirds would eventually settle upon Bardstown, Kentucky, Amy's hometown, which was just 40 or so miles away from where the two had gotten married in Louisville. They immediately got to work on building a family of their own, and eventually brought another son into the fold, Parker, who was born just 2 years later. As he got older, many would comment that Parker was the spitting image of Jason, and the two shared an extreme love of baseball. Jason Ellis joined the Bardstown police force in 2006, and he would serve there until the day he died. May 24th, 2013. A day like any other for this idyllic young family in the heartland of America. It was the Friday right before the Memorial Day holiday, so an extended weekend was right in their sights. Jason had now served with the Bardstown police force for close to 7 years, and had become an upstanding member of the community, winning Officer of the Year in 2008. He was a canine drug officer, in fact, the only one in all of Bardstown. On this chosen day, however, his canine-equipped vehicle was in the shop, so he was using a run-of-the-mill police cruiser. His German Shepherd canine partner, Figo, taking a small staycation at the family home. For the time period in which his canine-equipped cruiser would be getting repaired, Jason was driving a run-of-the-mill police cruiser. This one, however, did not have any dash cam at the front of the vehicle. It was approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, and Jason uses his car radio to inform dispatch that he's off for the night. 139 Adam off duty, he says. Dispatch confirms his call, and Jason begins to drive home. He goes south down Stephen Foster Avenue, then heads onto the overpass which leads him to the Bluegrass Parkway. This is the same route Jason uses to drive home every single night. His work schedule keeps him away from his family on most nights, due to him working the evening shift. On the road, there is barely another soul in sight, and the entire area of Bardstown seems almost vacant. Everyone's squirreled asleep in their houses this early on a Friday morning. It takes Jason roughly 10 minutes to reach his stop, exit 34. This is the stop just minutes away from his home, a heavily shrouded wooded road that leads to the neighboring towns of Springfield and Bloomfield. Thankfully, it is not this night that Officer Jason Ellis meets his fate. On this night, at approximately 2:30 in the morning, Jason makes it home. His German Shepherd police companion, Figo, waits for him outside, just like he does every night the two are apart. He's then greeted at the door by Amy, who fitfully sleeps on the couch until he arrives home every morning. Amy then goes to bed, but Jason stays up for a little bit to watch TV. Eventually, he gets tired enough to go to bed, and when Amy is woken up by her alarm clock at 5:45 a.m., Jason is deep asleep right next to her. The day starts off just like any other weekday. Amy wakes up the kids and heads to school, Bardstown Elementary, where she occasionally works as a substitute teacher. In the chaos of everything, she forgets to kiss her husband goodbye, letting him sleep through the morning. The day proceeds just like any other Friday, with some small exceptions. Amy, along with Hunter and Parker, celebrate the school's field day with a flurry of outdoor activities. That afternoon, the family has a brief encounter at home. Just as Amy and their sons are getting back from school, Jason is departing for his work shift. Jason starts his workday just like any other. 139 on duty, he says over his car radio, at approximately 3:52 that afternoon. He begins his beat in downtown Bardstown, making a couple of traffic stops, but nothing dramatic. A little bit after 5:30 p.m., Jason arrives at Dean Watts Park, where Amy is watching their son play t-ball. Jason coaches the team along with his fellow officer, Andrew Riley, a police veteran that had become Jason's best friend since joining the police force. On this early evening, Jason comes to the field in a pretty grim mood. He's only there for a few minutes before being called away to work. He leaves in a hurry, not even saying goodbye to Amy or their sons. Jason responds to a call that comes over his police radio. A domestic disturbance about an ex-boyfriend harassing a young woman at her house. The call ends with Jason writing a ticket for the ex-boyfriend and leaving the scene peacefully, hoping to make it back to his son's t-ball game. About half an hour later, Jason returns to the field, but the game is already over. Families are packing up everything and leaving, and again, Jason doesn't stay long. Again, he forgets to say goodbye to Amy and the kids, being pulled away for work. Amy and the kids head home, piling on the couch and eventually falling asleep to the Disney Channel. She tries to call Jason a couple of times, but the calls don't go through. Jason likely busy with his route. At around 9 p.m., Jason and a couple of his fellow officers decide to grill up some sausage. So he stops by his regular convenience store to pick up some cheese. A couple of hours later, he meets up with a friend and fellow officer, Andrew Riley, in a parking lot. The two regularly do this on slow nights like this, parking alongside each other and just talking about whatever's going on in their lives. A short time later, after the two separate, Andrew and Jason text each other about a large cardboard cutout of Jason that sits in the window of a local drugstore. The two joke about it. Andrew refers to it as freaky shit and jokes about uploading it to Reddit. It's around 11 o'clock at night when Jason finally calls home, barely missing Amy, who has nodded off with the kids on the couch. She immediately calls back though, and the two finally have the short conversation that's been eluding them all day. They end this conversation by telling each other that they love one another, and Jason says that he'll see her when he gets home. The next couple of hours for Jason are consumed by a single call, responding to a drunk and disorderly man by the name of Joseph William Hamilton. Jason is visibly surprised and infuriated. Hamilton only has one arm, but is drunk to the point of being hostile, and during his drunken ordeal has suffered a head wound. He's bleeding, and Jason calls for an EMS to assist him after detaining Hamilton. Jason heads back out on his route, undoubtedly hoping to spend the rest of his shift in peaceful solitude. But just a few minutes later, he is warned that Hamilton, still conscious and drunk, is causing trouble for the EMS taking him to the hospital. So he is called to assist the EMS at the hospital and ensure Hamilton is pliant enough to receive care for his head wound, at which point he is to be taken to the county jail, likely headed to the drunk tank. When Jason arrives at the hospital, he finds the security guard trying to restrain a thrashing Hamilton, who immediately recognizes Jason as his arresting officer. Hamilton immediately launches into a tirade, threatening to kill Jason in very explicit, graphic detail. Jason brushes off the threats as being all drunken bluster, and begins taking Hamilton to the Nelson County Jail. The process is simple enough, and within minutes, Hamilton has been locked up in county, awaiting bail. Jason jokes with Sergeant Nancy Shekels, not knowing that she'll be one of the last people that he'll ever talk to. He gets back in his cruiser, then heads down Stephen Foster Avenue on his way home. He then gets on the Bluegrass Parkway, the same route he drives every single night. Amy, Hunter, Parker, and Figo all await him at home, just 20 or so minutes away. He then calls off duty for the last time.
139, fine.
139 off duty, 0200.
Officer Jason Ellis takes exit 34, the road that leads towards Springfield and Bloomfield, but more importantly, home. As he exits the freeway, slowing down on the gas pedal, he begins to approach something that's lying in the middle of the road, an obstruction of sorts. What we know about Jason is that he wasn't the sort of person to just let someone else deal with this. He stops his police cruiser and gets out, hoping to quickly clear away the obstruction so that he could get home to his family. As he gets closer, it's evident that the obstruction is a mass of branches and tree limbs, which isn't an odd thing to see in this wooded, shrouded area. But while Jason is beginning to clear away the obstruction of branches and other tree parts, a figure waits on a nearby ledge overlooking the road. This wasn't an accidental obstruction. This was an ambush. Whoever was waiting for him, whoever had planned this attack, fires down upon Jason with a shotgun. Jason is hit with at least 2 different types of ammunition. Ammunition usually used for hunting rodents and other small animals. In total, Officer Jason Ellis is shot 3 times. getting hit multiple times in the chest, abdomen, right arm, and head. Within minutes, he has passed away, executed by someone that had planned this attack well ahead of time. An undetermined amount of time later, likely just 10 or 15 minutes, a Toyota Corolla pulls up behind Jason's police cruiser. The driver, a teenager, was driving home two drunk family members, one of which, likely his mother, told him to pull up behind the police cruiser and simply wait. Meanwhile, Chad Monroe, a local man that worked at the nearby Heaven Hill distillery, had just finished his work shift and was headed home. He made the same turn onto exit 34 and pulled in just behind the Toyota, which was idling behind Officer Ellis's police cruiser. This was around 2:36 a.m., approximately half an hour after Jason had last been seen or heard from. Chad Monroe decides to step out of his vehicle and he approaches the Toyota, trying to figure out what's going on. The people inside that car seem to have no idea, having been idling there for just a minute or two. So it is Mr. Monroe that steps forward towards the police cruiser, which is stopped near a large mass of tree branches. This is when he makes visual contact with the body of Officer Jason Ellis, lying on the cold pavement in a pool of his own blood. Chad Monroe runs back to the Toyota and tells the people within to call the police. He then begins running back to Jason's body, hoping to administer CPR while searching for a pulse. At around 2:40 a.m., the drunk woman inside the Toyota enters Jason's police cruiser, where she would use his radio to begin communicating with local dispatchers.
Hello, hello. Officer down, Bluefield Road.
Station.
Officer down.
You need to give us a location.
Bluefield Road by the Y. There's been a tree limb or something. Officer down, please emergency.
Dispatch 126, line 22, 137. Can you start that way?
Badge, I'm on Bloomfield Road heading towards Old Bloomfield Road.
Towards the BG.
44 or 46, what's your status?
Their location on the BG?
Right by the BG, off of Bloomfield Road, towards the BG.
Dispatch, do you know what they're talking about?
Negative. Are you going to be in Bloomfield, ma'am? Bloomfield?
Off of Bloomfield, coming out of Bloomfield towards Springfield, off the BG.
It's going to be Highway 55 at the 34-mile marker, exit, 34-mile marker exit. Highway 55 is going to be Bloomfield Road there.
Dispatch, I'm Bloomfield Road, passing 162, Old Bloomfield Road, head that way.
10-4. 44 or 46, what's your status?
We're dropping them off right now. We're heading that way. We're going to be the Y in Bloomfield.
Yes, sir, towards the BG. Come Bloomfield off the Y towards the BG.
We're 10-4 on. 122, 126. Where did you say you were? I'm on Bloomfield Road. That's Chaparral State.
Ma'am, can you advise the status of the officer? Is he conscious?
I believe he's dead.
10-4. Ma'am, can you advise if this is going to be a car accident or if this is just a vehicle versus tree or what is going to happen?
Yes, sir. Hey, this is Chad Monroe. I know Mike Clark personally. I mean, I can tell him exactly where I'm at. We're on the BG Parkway. We're coming off. We're coming from Bardstown, getting off on the Bluefield Springfield exit.
I mean, is this going to be a car accident? Is there another vehicle involved, or or is it just one vehicle versus a tree, or what?
I've come home from Heaven Hill Distillery. I've just got off work, and there was the police car is sitting in the middle of the road with the lights on, and we didn't know what it was. It's a tree across the road, and I didn't know what it was, and I got out, and I went up there and looked, and it's him. I believe somebody hit him.
Okay, can you tell if he is breathing?
No, sir, he is not breathing. Body temperature is cold.
Dispatch, have you already got EMS toned out that way?
That's correct. We've got EMS started.
Clark and Oakland Funeral Home.
Oh, Brian?
Yes.
This is Sherry out of dispatch. We have a squad call for a coroner. I will believe we have one of our officers down. We think they're on the off-ramp of the Bluegrass at the Bloomfield exit. We had passersby calling in on the officer's radio, and that's where we think they are, on the off-ramp at the Bloomfield exit.
All right, on our way.
Okay, thank you.
Officer Andrew Riley, Jason's best friend and texting buddy, is one of the first officers to arrive at the scene. He arrives to find Jason's body pierced by what looks like gravel. His first thought was that Jason had been hit by a car and then dragged some distance. But on further inspection, he finds that the small piercings and bruises on Jason's skin were not caused by gravel, but by buckshot. It wasn't until he had arrived at the scene and began taking off Jason's shirt and vest that he made this startling revelation, which indicated that a darker, more ominous crime had unfolded just minutes prior to his arrival.
I come down Bloomfield Road, which is 62, and then we cut across 55 over top of the Bluegrass. And so we actually came down the exit backwards. And the only thing I could see at first, right as soon as I was crossing the Bluegrass, I could see the reflection of his lights on the exit ramp. That's the only way I knew that they were actually on the ramp, because from either end of the exit you couldn't see anything. I just barely saw his lights hit the trees. I pulled down the ramp. Got as close to him as I could with the tree branches were still in the roadway when I got there. A couple people were standing out of their cars. Mr. Monroe was down on the ground beside him. I ran up to him and started doing what I could that I thought could help, and then EMS was there. It seemed like almost instantly, and there was nothing else to do.
Now, we're going to pause for just a moment to hear a word from today's sponsors. One can't even imagine the kind of horror that must have overwhelmed everyone, not only those that knew Jason well, like his family or fellow officers, but the entire community itself. To have a beacon of the community, a father, a decorated police officer, a t-ball coach, executed in cold blood. It's something that nightmares are made of, and to be killed so close to home by someone that had been obviously lying in wait makes it even worse. On the day of Jason's murder, Police Chief Rick McCubbin held a press conference and vowed not only justice, but vengeance against the person or persons responsible.
It's an eye for an eye. You kill one of my guys, I'm not going to rest till I have you in cuffs or on the front side of a weapon, and I mean that.
As hundreds of police officers, first responders, family, and friends made their way to Highview Cemetery in Nelson County, fallen Bardstown police officer Jason Ellis made his final journey, followed by his canine partner.
Ready?
And Jason, I know you're here. I know you're with us. And yes, just like you ended all your conversations with me, you're my chief. You're my chief. And I am your chief, Jason. But you are now our hero. And you must know that your chief will not stand down. Nor will this group of law enforcement officers right here, or probably the hundreds of thousands of officers across this country, that his death has rattled their cage as well.
Early this past Saturday morning, a beloved husband, father, son, brother, and friend exhibited this great love. Jason gave his life for his country, for his community, for his family, for all of us.
Probably the biggest memory is his absolute desecration of the electric slide. He was told to stick with policing.
He always had that big smile, that big grin on his face, no matter what was going on. Just like you've heard, he was always fun. The action, well, it was always wherever Jason was.
Jason, my friend, rest easy. We've got it from here.
Officer Jason Ellis was buried just a short distance away from the home where his family lived, in Nelson County's Highview Cemetery. His funeral was a tragic remembrance of Jason's life, culminating in many tears and his German Shepherd canine partner, Figo, placing a mournful paw upon his casket. Amy Ellis, along with the couple's 2 sons and the rest of the community really, began to grieve Jason's death, but a dangerous sentiment began to be spread throughout Bardstown. If something like this had happened to a police officer, a paragon of honor throughout the community, how would anyone be truly safe? And a much more important question was then asked. Exactly who was responsible? Unfortunately, the case file began to grow cold before the investigation ever really took off. The investigation to find Jason's killer, headed by the Kentucky State Police, was looking at any and every possible avenue for a lead. With no eyewitnesses or murder weapons to go off of, the investigation had to lean on an enticing $200,000 reward for information, most of which was raised in a fundraising effort by citizens of Bardstown. It is, by almost all standards, the largest reward in Kentucky state history. Despite having no real leads to go off of, the investigators were certain that at least 2 people had been at the crime scene, based off of information not yet released to the public. State Police Master Trooper Norman Chaffins said in the early days of the investigation, quote, "There are some indicators to us that would lead us to believe that there was more than one person." Many people believe this is because there were 2 types of ammunition found at the crime scene, but it is unknown why police came to that determination. During one of his several press conferences about this shocking crime, Bardstown Police Chief Rick McCubbin told the media that the person or persons responsible for this ambush would have required, quote, "a degree of tactical precision." His comment seemed to spark concerns that this might have been a crime committed by someone with military or marksmanship experience, perhaps a former soldier, a fellow cop, etc. This led to all kinds of wild gossip about this being a professional hit, but if so, that would lead to all kinds of further questions. Who would want to kill Jason Ellis, who was, by all accounts, a great guy? Investigators looked into his personal life, searching for any straw they could grasp, but they found nothing. No gambling debts, no personal vendettas, nothing. His personal life seemed to be as squeaky clean as his public persona. A lead then arose in the days after the shooting, when it was announced that a letter had been received by Bardstown Police, threatening violence against other officers. No details of this letter were released to the public, but it was announced that the FBI were contacted to help examine the letter. Analysts and agents with the FBI examined this document, and determined that it was likely not written by the actual killer. However, that did very little to ease the tensions of fellow officers, and local residents. The real fear among Bardstown citizens was that the gunman was walking among them. Arlene Durbin, the owner of Arlene's Barber Shop in the picturesque downtown Bardstown, stated, quote, "What scares us? If they will kill a police officer, what's to stop them from killing anybody else? To think there's someone walking the streets that cold-blooded and ruthless. So, what would inspire someone to commit such a cold-blooded murder, an execution some call, against this highly regarded man? Well, if you would have asked Bardstown City Council member Tommy Reed, he'd tell you, quote, "I believe it was a hit. Ellis was putting a dent into somebody's drug trade, and they finally got tired of it and put a hit out on him. I think he was under surveillance so they would know his routine." As you can expect, this would begin to circulate questions about anyone involved in the Bardstown drug trade and potential ties to Jason Ellis. This leads us to the first solid lead that investigators would have in this case. A group of young men calling themselves the Bardstown Money Gang.
Several police believe is tied to a violent new group called the Bardstown Money Gang. Bardstown Money Gang. Bardstown Money Gang.
Like most gangs, the self-proclaimed Bardstown Money Gang, also known as the BMG, pride themselves on their illicit and criminal activities. At least, they did when that rap music video was created and uploaded to YouTube in October of 2013. Officer Jason Ellis, while also being a canine officer, was one of Bardstown's most prolific narcotics officers. While he mostly dealt with small-time drug dealers, Ellis also had some run-ins with members of the Bardstown Money Gang.
More than a month after police say several men beat up a 62-year-old man in a restaurant parking lot, arrests have been made.
And tonight, Bardstown police tell WLKY's Jessica O what likely sparked this fight. She joins us now with the story. Jessica?
Rick, police say the victim used a racial slur to describe these suspects who took serious offense and seriously assaulted that victim. The 3 young men have since been charged, and tonight one is still on the loose.
This is DeAndre Douglas, and authorities in Bardstown say he's one of 3 guys responsible for attacking a man at this Bardstown huddle house in November.
They stated that some words were exchanged between the 2 parties and the fight broke out in the parking lot.
That fight left the 62-year-old victim, Joseph Hagan, with serious injuries, but police told us today his words likely started this argument.
He was using some derogatory terms, and that's what sparked the initial fight.
Those derogatory terms were racial slurs, and police say they were directed at these suspects who followed the victim outside and beat him up before running away. It wasn't until last week that authorities were able to arrest a couple of them. Martin Barber was arrested by Lebanon police, then Officer Jason Ellis got a lucky break when he randomly pulled a car over with the other 2 suspects inside.
During the initial traffic stop, DeAndre actually bailed out as the car was still moving. I took my chances that Darian was in the car, and got lucky, and he was.
The only person of the 3 suspects on the run right now, DeAndre Douglas, who police described as armed and dangerous. I'm Jessica O, WLKY.
DeAndre Douglas, the leader of the Bardstown Money Gang, was nearly arrested by Jason Ellis, who made the lucky traffic stop and arrested one of the assault suspects, Darian Ellery. DeAndre Douglas and the other suspect would be arrested within weeks by Jason and other Bardstown police officers. But these encounters would be just the tip of the iceberg when it came to the Bardstown police force dealing with the BMG. In August of 2013, a few months after the death of Jason Ellis, a party was being held in rural Nelson County. This party, which was full of young adults and teenagers, was interrupted by a contingency of young guys chanting BMG and Big Money Bardstown Gang. These men began to attack the partygoers, including the young women present. Officers with the Nelson County Sheriff's Department responded to the incident, arresting 2 suspects but believing that there were many more of the BMG involved. During the arrest, one of the suspects began to taunt the police officers with specific claims that the Bardstown Money Gang was responsible for the murder of Jason Ellis. One of the teenage partygoers, who was assaulted by these members of the Bardstown Money Gang, claimed that she was attacked by one suspect in particular, a young 23-year-old man by the name of Brant Shekels. She claims that Shekels was just one of the multiple attackers, and that she was personally kicked in the stomach and head by him. I include this name in particular because Brant Shekels was the 23-year-old nephew of then Bardstown Mayor Bill Shekels. As you can imagine, this led to quite the outcry over the next several weeks. The teenage partygoer that alleged being assaulted by Brant Shekels also claimed that multiple members of the BMG had been chanting throughout their attack. In particular, they had been chanting that they were cop killers and were preparing to do worse to anyone that got in their way. It seemed to many that even if the BMG were full of hot air and bluster, they were quickly becoming a menace to the region of Bardstown, Kentucky.
The top law enforcement officials in Nelson County met in private today to find a way to deal with the growing problem of a group of criminals who call themselves the Bardstown Money Gang. WLKY's Drew Douglas filed this report earlier tonight.
Running around beating on little kids and women and older people. It's just, doesn't need to happen in this community.
Police say the Bardstown Money Gang likes to pick on the helpless, like last weekend when authorities say they attacked underage girls at a field party on King Road. Bardstown Mayor Bill Shekels' nephew, Brant Shekels, was arrested.
You can pick your friends, but unfortunately you can't always pick your relatives.
Sheriff Stephen Campbell says one BMG member bragged about killing Officer Jason Ellis the night of the party, the second time he's done so since the May murder.
It's my understanding that they ruled him out on that. He's not considered a suspect. So he's doing that to get attention.
Police Chief Rick McCubbin estimates the group to have around a dozen members, but can't be sure. He says they lock up the men in their early 20s and late teens all the time for misdemeanor crimes, but their punishments aren't keeping them behind bars.
The state as a whole is more worried about saving dollars than putting somebody in jail that needs to be in jail. And until we change that, we're going to continue to do this.
So the police chief, mayor, sheriff, county attorney, and Commonwealth's attorney met inside the Nelson County Justice Center for around an hour, hoping to find a solution. Campbell says they're going to learn more about gang activity and press the most severe charges possible. Both he and McCubbin say they have zero tolerance for what's been going on.
And they want to be a part of a gang. We're going to afford them that title that they've worked so hard to get. We're going to treat them like a gang.
After the assault on the party in August, Shekels, along with 4 other members of the Bardstown Money Gang, were arrested. This was Brant Shekels' second arrest in 2 months, and the second time he had publicly claimed credit on behalf of the BMG for the murder of Officer Jason Ellis. Mayor Bill Shekels, the first black mayor of Bardstown, was already dealing with enough criticism before his familial ties to the BMG became public knowledge. His nephew's criminal endeavors did nothing to help, and it took Mayor Shekels a few days to come out and make a public statement. In his statement, Bill Shekels was unapologetic for his nephew's actions and seemed rather disinterested in protecting him. Quote, "You can pick your friends, but unfortunately you can't always pick your relatives. Anything that he does or anybody else named Shekels does, they don't get any special treatment. If they're guilty, they're guilty. If they break the law, they break the law. They suffer the punishment just like anyone else." The Bardstown Money Gang, in addition to this assault on a group of partying teenagers, had also been tied to a series of assaults on elderly Bardstown citizens in the months prior. Bardstown public officials pleaded to the state government to increase the punishment for this type of violent attack, but they had no such luck. Eventually, Brant Shekels and the other members of the Bardstown Money Gang that were arrested in connection to the August attack accepted a plea deal given to them by the Nelson County Circuit Court District Attorney's Office. Shekels pleaded guilty to 4th-degree assault, which is only a misdemeanor in the state of Kentucky, and riot in the 1st degree, which is only a Class D felony. These charges were a lot lighter than many had anticipated, especially since there were multiple eyewitnesses and statements of guilt given by the perpetrators of the attack. Shekels was eventually sentenced to 4 years in state prison. His 2 charges, 4 years for trying to incite a riot, and then an additional year for assaulting the teenage partygoers, would run concurrently. Throughout the region, many believed that Shekels had been given a lenient sentence due to his familial connections to the mayor of Bardstown, accusations that former mayor Bill Shekels denies wholeheartedly. The other charged members of the Bardstown Money Gang were given similar sentences, as well as nearly identical probationary terms. They would not be allowed to gather in large groups for some time after their release, and would be unable to associate themselves with the moniker Bardstown Money Gang. Over the years, the investigation into Officer Jason Ellis's death has been handled by the Kentucky State Police. They would receive tips from all across the nation, but unfortunately, none would lead to any significant suspects or arrest. In July of 2014, more than a year after the ambush took place, an inmate at the nearby Louisville Corrections Facility was questioned. This inmate, 33-year-old Danny Early, had apparently threatened a guard by saying, quote, "You'll be pushing up daisies like Jason Ellis, the Bardstown cop that was killed." This threat followed Early's arrest for public intoxication, which had been marked by Early telling the arresting officers something about Officer Ellis and the Cornbread Mafia. In case you're unfamiliar with the Cornbread Mafia, it was a nickname given to a local Kentucky-centered drug empire that collapsed in the late 1980s. This lead, while enticing, was ultimately fruitless. Police don't believe that Danny Early had any substantive information about Jason Ellis. Most likely, he was just an inmate caught up on local gossip, who wanted to puff his chest a bit when given the opportunity to. Major Jeremy Thompson of the Kentucky State Police oversaw the investigation up until 2018, when he accepted a new position in the office of U.S. Attorney Russell Coleman. Speaking to the media, Major Thompson stated that the lead investigators had been unable to confirm major aspects of the case, such as Officer Ellis even being the target of the ambush. His comment hinted at the possibility of there being major gaps in the investigation, such as there being a potential motive or even a target for the unknown culprit. Because of that, it remains possible, however tragic, that Officer Jason Ellis was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Major Jeremy Thompson also stated that investigators had received and investigated tips from all over the nation. These tips included everything from Officer Ellis preparing to turn in a dirty cop, to him preparing to bust a local burglary ring, to him being prepared to take down a local drug empire, a la the Cornbread Mafia. All of these tips have failed to produce any real evidence, seeming to be fueled more by gossip than anything substantial or real. Investigators continue to work on Jason's case to this day, but it unfortunately remains open and unsolved. Sadly, there was further tragedy on the horizon for the loved ones of Officer Jason Ellis. Nearly 4 years to the day of Jason's death, May 23rd, 2017, his former canine partner, Figo, passed away at the age of 11. The German Shepherd had been living with members of Jason and Amy's family in the 4 years since, and, for months prior to his passing, had been battling illness. Thankfully, he was able to pass away peacefully in his sleep, in the place that he now called home. Figo was cremated, and his ashes were placed in an urn, which sat at the base of Jason's gravestone for some time. Eventually, he would be buried right next to Jason, cementing his legacy as the man's best friend. Despite investigators being unable to say much of anything regarding the active state of the case, local journalists and reporters continue to report on the story, marking the anniversary of Jason's death every May. Amy, the widow of Jason Ellis, has struggled to recover from his loss over the past half-decade. Following his death, she had to move away from the region, not only for herself, but for her 2 sons, Parker and Hunter, both of whom have now had to spend roughly half of their lives without their father. Speaking to a local reporter, Amy talked about this move and stated why it was necessary. Quote, "I distanced myself from that so I could try to feel safe and bring my boys up as normal as possible, as I know Jason would want me to. It is very frustrating. I don't like to go back to Bardstown because it feels so heavy. I think every year I'm in a better place, but it never fails. The weather starts changing, the smell in the air. It brings you back to the day before, and you just relive it, and it plays over in your head. Parker is playing baseball, and just this past week, being at the field kind of brought back the smells and the feel. The very last place I saw Jason was at the baseball field." Despite suffering through grief, depression, PTSD, and all of the anguish that comes from a deceased spouse, Amy has been able to find a sliver of light. In the wake of Jason's death, she tried to promote a positive mentality with their 2 sons, that even though their father was no longer with them, he could be remembered fondly, and he would want them to all live their best lives moving forward. Even though it's been hard for her to live up to her words, she has attempted to do just that. She has since fallen in love and remarried, more than 5 years after Jason's death. Her new husband has met with Jason's surviving family members multiple times, and they all approve, saying that if Jason could pick anyone for Amy to spend the rest of her life with, it would be him. In 2017, Kentucky State Police brought back 2 retired detectives to focus on Jason's case full-time, even though Jason's case was their main incentive, him being a murdered police officer and all. His story was not their only objective. These 2 retired detectives were also tasked with investigating a handful of other unsolved crimes from Bardstown's Nelson County, one of which was the murder of a mother and daughter, which unfolded roughly 1 year after the death of Jason Ellis. Their story, like that of Officer Jason Ellis, remains unresolved. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. As you can imagine, this episode is just the first of several detailing the many unsolved crimes to plague Bardstown over the past several years. This episode was just the first of many, with what was originally a 2-part series back in 2016 growing into a 6, 7, or even 8-part series when all is said and done. It's really a work in progress, so it's hard to gauge at the moment, but this is quickly becoming my longest series to date. If any of you would like to stay up to date with the podcast, make sure to look us up on social media. Just search for Unresolved or Unresolved Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and it should pop up for you. If you would like, you can send in any emails to michael@unresolved.me. That's michael@unresolved.me. And you could send in any voicemails or text to 831-200-3550. If you want to find a transcript of this episode, or any applicable links or sources, just head to the podcast website, which is unresolved.me. There, you'll also find a link to the podcast store at the top of the page, as well as a link to our Patreon page, which is always patreon.com/unresolvedpod. By the time you're listening to this, part 2 of the new re-recorded Bardstown series should already be out, but until then everyone, stay safe, and I will talk to you later.